Hi everyone, thank you very much for watching this sample lecture for the English department at北星学園University. My name is Rob Thompson and I am a lecturer here at the English department. Now before we begin, what I would like you to do is I would like you to get a piece of paper and a pen. So make sure that where you are right now, you have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you. So feel free to pause this video right now and get yourself a pen and piece of paper. Okay? All right, so hopefully you have a pen and piece of paper in front of you because you may need to take notes. Now, the theme for today is Introduction to Digital Media. In the English department, we have a lot of different subjects, and it's not all just learning English. At the English department, a lot of it is about learning in English. You know, that's a really big focus for us. So, English department, social media though, what has social media got to do with English? Well, most people around the world use social media to communicate. Of course, English speakers too. So let's learn a little bit about Westerners' use of social media. Now here is a question for you. What do you think of when you hear the term social media? What do you think of when you hear the term social media? I'd like you to pause the video and write down 2 keywords on a piece of paper. 2 keywords that are related, or you think are related to, the term social media. Okay, so pause the video and write down two keywords on a piece of paper. Okay, hopefully you have 2 keywords on your piece of paper there that are related to social media. Now let's have a look at some keywords that other students have thought of when they think of the term social media. So the question was, what do you think of when you hear the term social media? We've got Instagram, Facebook. Instagram's the biggest one here, interestingly. So when students think of social media, it seems that they think of Instagram the most. Twitter was an often mentioned keyword. Facebook, convenience, right? Some students thought that social media was convenient. Scary. There's something about social media that's a little bit scary. Information, useful, Snapchat, right? There's lots of different kind of concepts that we might think of when we think of the term social media. Here's another question for you. Which SNS do you use most in everyday life? Which SNS do you use most in everyday life? Once again, pause the video and write down your answer on a piece of paper. All right, so pause the video and write down your answer on a piece of video. Okay, so hopefully you have an answer down there on your piece of paper. So let's have a look now at some answers that students gave last year in response to this question. So students, last year, in response to this question, which SNS do you use most in everyday life? The majority said Instagram. If the word is bigger, it means that more people mentioned that keyword. So Instagram, Line, and Twitter seem to be the most popular SNS. Discord, this is a fairly minor SNS, but some people use it. Google, some people use Google. Right, so there's lots of different SNS that people use in everyday life. It seems that one of our students is learning Chinese. We don't only learn English, or there's lots of opportunities to learn other languages at the English department as well. And one of our students decided that they would put their answer in Chinese. Okay, another question for you. We're going to get into the lecture in a moment, but I just want to get you thinking about social media and how we use it in everyday life. What I'd like you to do is please rank or order. Please rank the following SNS by popularity, 1 to 6, among teenagers in the US. So this is where you have to guess, make a prediction. Which of these SNS do you think is most popular in the US among teenagers, and which is the least popular, do you think? All right, so if you think, for example, I don't know, maybe if you think Line is the most popular SNS among teenagers in the US, then you would put a 1 at Line. If you think Pinterest is the second most, you'd put a 2, right, all the way down to 6, the least popular. Okay, so have a guess. Please pause the video and have a guess what you think is the most to the least popular SNS in the US for teenagers. Okay, so hopefully you have a ranking there. Now let's have a look at what ranking students last year predicted for teenagers in the US. This is what students predicted. They predicted that Facebook would be the most popular SNS among teenagers. Instagram would be the second most popular. Twitter, the third most popular. Google Plus, fourth most popular. Tumblr, fifth most. Pinterest, sixth. And then something else might be seventh. Right? So this was the prediction. The prediction, or what students last year guessed what the most popular SNS in English-speaking countries is. Let's have a look at the actual data. So this was in 2012. At the end of 2012, in the US, the most important social media sites for teens was Facebook. Facebook was the most popular SNS for teens. Twitter was second most. Instagram was third. Google Plus, Tumblr, Pinterest. Right? So if we go back and have a look, the prediction that was made by the students last year here at Hokusei was pretty much exactly what the data in 2012 said in terms of what students use, or at least in terms of what teens use in the US. But let's have a look at the end of 2013. What happened at the end of 2013? After just 1 year, the popularity of Facebook reduced hugely. The popularity of Facebook reduced hugely. Twitter was pretty much the same. Instagram, a huge increase in the popularity of Instagram in 2013. And then we have other. Something else in 2013 has burst onto the scene here. What could it be? Before we get into the question of what that new SNS was that came onto the scene in 2013 in the US, I'd like you to once again pause the video and write down your answer to this question. What is one positive aspect of using social media? Respond in one word. Okay, what is one positive aspect of using social media? Respond in one word. So please pause the video and write down your answer on a piece of paper. Okay, so hopefully you have your answer. What is one positive aspect of using social media? Here are all the answers from Hokusei students last year in response to that question. So what is one positive aspect of using social media? We have useful, getting information, communication, connect with others, fun. What else have we got? Can connect around the world. Yep. Snapchat. Somebody loves Snapchat. Interactive communication. So I guess we know what's happening around us. We can enjoy talking to others. We can know what happens around the world in terms of fashion, right? So there's a lot of keywords or a lot of ideas that students responded with were related to this idea of it being useful, finding information, and communicating with others. Are any of these ideas on your list? And another question for you. What is one negative aspect of using social media? Respond in one word. Right? So once again, pause the video and write down your answer to this question on a piece of paper. What is one negative aspect of using social media? Respond in one word. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you have paused the video and you wrote down one negative aspect of using social media. So now let's have a look at some of the words or some of the terms or phrases that students last year here at Hokusei wrote down in response to this question, what is one negative aspect of using social media? Dangerous, cannot see faces, fraud, scary, privacy. Right? Privacy is one of those things that people are a bit concerned about. Here's an interesting one. Can't stop using. So addiction, right? Here's a very strong opinion. Social media is poison. Incorrect information, right? This whole thing about fake news these days. We can end up exchanging messages with people who we don't know. Less time, I guess it uses up our time. Not communicating real, so maybe no real communication, right? So there are negative aspects that people, I think, kind of already know about, right? Were any of these concepts on your list? Now, let's get back to this, this graph that we have here, this figure that showed a huge change in the US in the popularity of SNS, right? Facebook, a huge drop in popularity at the end of 2013. Instagram, a huge increase in popularity at the end of 2013. And then something else came onto the scene and I guess replaced Facebook in a way. But what was this? Let's have a think about that. One thing that I think is related to this change, this move away from Facebook, is this concept of context collapse. Context collapse. This is a concept that internet psychologists came up with to refer to a particular situation that social medias face or encounter on social media. Now, context collapse, what is it? Context collapse is easy to understand when we think about the fact that we belong to multiple social spheres in everyday life, right? We have our family. We have lab, or this could be our zemi or our classmates at school or university. Maybe we have a part-time job. So we have our workmates, and we have acquaintances, we have close friends, right? And depending on which social sphere we are in, our identity is slightly different, right? So when we're with our family, maybe when you're with your grandmother or grandparents, you want to be a good kid, you want to make sure that you kind of live up to your parents' values. When you're at school, you're a studious, serious self. That's the person that you are. When you're at work, the kind of person that you are is you're professional, polite, right? When you're with your close friends, maybe you're a bit of a goof. Maybe you're happy-go-lucky, right? You don't care too much about what your friends think about you. But the problem with social media, especially Facebook, is that all of these social spheres, all of these contexts, they get collapsed together, right? So if we add as friends on Facebook or on SNS, if we add family, if we add our workmate, our schoolmates, our lab mates, if we add our acquaintances, if we add our workmates, if we add our close friends to our networks on social network sites such as Facebook, then suddenly we have all of these different people from different contexts in one space, right? So what do you tweet? What kind of photo do you post, right? You might think, I want to post this photo because my close friends might like it. But that photo might not be appropriate for your workmates. Maybe your parents might get offended by that photo. Right? So this idea of context collapse, that there are multiple audiences on social media, I think this might be having some kind of an effect on the kinds of social media, or SNS, that teens in the US are choosing. Now, this idea of multiple audiences is not new. At the beginnings of electronic media, there was the example of the American 1960s civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael. Before television, he would give speeches to large gatherings of people. But generally, he could speak to a majority white audience and adjust the topics that he talked about to those people. And when he talked to majority black audience, he could adjust the way he spoke and the way and the topics that he talked about for those audiences. But when television came along, Carmichael had to make a decision. The people that were listening on the other side of the television to his televised speeches were a mix of different people, with different values. So suddenly he had a dilemma, right? He had to choose how he would speak and which audience he would speak to, but that would alienate, some people wouldn't agree with what he was saying. Right? And this concept has different names as well. Group co-presence, the multiple audience problem, conflicting social spheres, context collapse. The multiple audience problem is something that we might see at a wedding. At a wedding, there are multiple different audiences, different people come together. And when you're giving a speech, sometimes it might be difficult to know, should I say this and make these people happy? But then if I say that, then maybe these people will get upset, right? So this idea of juggling or trying to adjust ourselves to different audiences is nothing new. But now we have context collapse. Now we have SNS. So we have this new environment in which we have to struggle with how we present ourselves to different people. So I think that context collapse is one reason why teens in the US, by around the end of 2013, many of them were moving to Snapchat. Snapchat as an SNS for them to use. As we can see from 2013, 2 years until 2015, there was a huge increase in teen use of Snapchat. And I think one of the reasons for this is because of context collapse. Teens were using Facebook, but their Facebook networks were becoming clogged or messy with different audiences. But if they used Snapchat, they could control more carefully who they added as friends on Snapchat. They could control who saw their posts. They could adjust, they could make sure that it was only their friends that were seeing their posts on Snapchat. So teens solved the problem of context collapse using this new SNS platform. So some main points for you. Social media use is changing all the time. And we need to understand how people use social media and other media. And when we understand how people use social media, we can deepen our understanding about how people around the world communicate with each other. Especially for those of you who are considering careers or pursuing fluency in English or other languages, it's natural that you might end up going to a country in which people speak a different language, interact in different ways, and use different social networking sites. So understanding how people around the world use this digital media can be a really good way of understanding how people in those countries communicate with each other. So I hope you enjoyed this sample lecture. As I mentioned, at北星学園 University, we do not only teach English, we teach in English. Not all of the classes are in English, but there are many opportunities to learn university-level classes in English to really boost your abilities in academic English, in communicating, in thinking actively about issues around the world that are affecting us today. So thank you very much again, and I hope to see you one day here at the English department at 北星学園 University. Bye-bye.